afternoon, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I am the Doug Buchanan, Editor-in-Chief of Columbus Business First and a member of the CMC Board of Trustees. We are so pleased you're all here with us today. Before we begin, we'd also like to thank today's forum sponsor, Barnes & Thornburg, at a table right up front. And we'd also like to thank the Grange Insurance Autobahn Center for supporting today's program. And a thank you to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream. How about a hand for all of our sponsors? Okay, on to today's forum. In 2019, Ohio enacted a law to provide more than $1 billion in bailouts for private power plants with ratepayer money. Justice Department officials later linked this law to more than $60 million in bribes. Former Ohio House Speaker Larry Householder, who along with others was implicated in the scandal, is expected to stand trial beginning next week for his alleged role in the scheme. House Bill 6 remains on the books and sits at the center of the largest corruption case in Ohio history, allegedly fueled by so-called dark money. Today we'll untangle this ongoing scandal and examine what can be done to mitigate the damage being done by dark money. Please welcome today's speakers. Ashley Brown, former two-term commissioner of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio and founding executive director of the Harvard Electricity Policy Group at the Harvard Kennedy School. Ashley, welcome. David DeVillers, partner with Barnes & Thornburg and former U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, and state prosecutor. Welcome, David. And Kathiann Kowalski, journalist with Eye on Ohio and the Energy News Network. Welcome, Kathiann. The podium is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak to you folks because you always have great questions and it's always an interesting topic. And today is a very interesting topic, so I don't want to belabor this. Let's get right to it. First of all, I guess we need to establish, just maybe one of you might want to say this, but I don't know, maybe all three want to weigh in, but what is dark money and why is it a problem?
I'll take that.
Okay.
For 5. Dark money refers to funds used to affect the political process that cannot be traced. It can be done in the form of a nonprofit or it can be done with a for-profit, but the basic concept is that it's money where you can't figure out what the ultimate source is.
That's probably a reason that we don't see a lot of heavy-handed control on it, correct?
No, and in fact, in the last 2 years, by ruling that I believe it was California could not have restrictions without the very good reason would be protecting the integrity of the electoral process.
Okay. So. In Cleveland.com today, there's a report that a nonprofit dark money group with ties to the natural gas industry pushed for legislation that ended up making it easier to drill for oil and gas in state parks, but it also redefined methane-based fuel as green energy in Ohio law. I'm assuming one of you would want to weigh in on that. Ashley?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, you could say whatever you want about natural gas, it ain't green energy. And the Ohio legislature, despite what they're claiming, can't methane emissions, their carbon emissions. It has an environmental benefit to the extent to which it displaces coal because coal emits more carbon than natural gas. And actually, most of the reductions in carbon emissions in the U.S. are due to natural gas. So there's a case to be made for natural gas. But to call it green is essentially to make Ohio a laughingstock, because nobody could possibly take that seriously for having inexplicably odd energy policies. But we can save that when we get into HB 6. But the answer is very simple. It ain't green energy.
Okay, well, you're leading where I want to go, and I know, Mr. DeVillers, this is something that you might want to weigh in on here. Former Ohio House Speaker, where tens of millions of dollars were funneled through dark money groups. Prosecutors say this is corruption. The defense will argue this is business, of policymaking. What impact do you think this
Long term, I don't think much. In the short term, I think it did. I think there was more scrutiny. I hope and think that both state and federal prosecutors and investigators will kind of look at dark money groups. And what we're really talking about in this case, in most cases, are 501c4s. And as was said, you do not have to divulge your donors to these groups. And you could have donors, you could have a bunch of people donating $50, thousands of people, or you could have one donor or one benefactor. And there's no way of finding out what it is if and until you execute a search warrant or subpoena documents. And at that time, I think in the short term, I hope that prosecutors and agencies look at these things and scrutinize these as the perfect ever needs to be done to the bribee, right? And these dark money groups, these 501c4s, are used to that, which by definition is money laundering. There's a bribe, and you're hiding the nature and source of those, the assets, which is the definition of money laundering, through the C4s.
Either of you have anything to add to that? I know you've covered this, Kathiann.
I mean, when you asked what effect will the trial have, if Householder and Borges are not found guilty, I would be afraid that you would have more entrenchment in the use of dark money. If they are found guilty, I think there may be this higher level of scrutiny David referred to, but I think a lot is going to depend on the outcome of the trial.
Ashley, as the former head of the PUCO, you know the role that agency plays in making, policies. The former head of the PUCO is at least implicated in some way in this. We don't know, he hasn't, there's no charges or anything else, but we know from the court documents that there was some role that he played in all of this. Are you surprised, and what do you think about the way the PUCO was involved in what we're seeing right now in the court documents?
Well, Chris, we don't know exactly what role the former chair you're talking about, that remains to be seen. And yet obviously, the First Energy has admitted to bribing him. He denies that he was bribed. But they made a series of decisions which were clearly favorable to him. And it's also factually established that he received a $4.3 million payment just before he was appointed to the commission, but when it was pretty clear he was going to be appointed. So that's suspicious. A couple of things are sort of disappointing to me about how the commission has handled this. One is there are 5 commissioners. And by the way, I was never the chair of the commission, I was a commissioner. And the chairman is one, in regard to policy, the chairman is only one of 5 members. What's amazing to me is that the others, with one single exception, consistently voted with the way that the chairman who's under suspicion was voting. And there was no discussion at commission meetings about what was going on. So you have to ask, number, what's the point of having 5 commissioners if 4 of them just follow the lead and don't do anything else? It's also interesting that this was in a context where it's been emailed, it's public, that Chuck Jones, the former CEO of First Energy, sent to some of his colleagues about a conversation he had with Sam Randazzo, in which when Rich Randazzo said he's going to take care of deferring the rate case that was up for whether they were going to have one or not. He was going to take care of deep sixing that rate case, but he needed time because there were people at the commission that suspected he worked for First Energy and not for the commission. Well, if commissioners were suspecting that, what were they doing about it? What was happening? And the commission's actions to date have been where they have taken some action. They've opened 4 inquiries, but frankly, those inquiries are kind of on the margins, and they haven't done what you would expect a commission in that circumstance to have done. One is they could have opened a proceeding about show cause why the license of the company shouldn't be revoked. A second is whether they breached their fiduciary obligation. You know, a number of years ago when I was on the commission, we had a similar case. not identical, because I don't know that it involved anything criminal, but it certainly involved serious abuses of duty to the ratepayer. It was, in that case, it was Columbia Gas that was buying high-priced gas from an affiliate that was on the brink of bankruptcy to bail them out, and then they wanted Ohio ratepayers to pay above market prices. And what did the commission do? We did a management audit. We said, you've got to change a bunch of things. We said, one of the things you need to change is you need to stop buying above market gas from affiliates. They said, no, we won't do that, and the commission fired the board of directors of the company. The company said, well, you don't have the authority to fire us. And they said, well, okay, you take it to court, that's fine. We could argue about that court. If you win, you know, if we win, you're going to have a new board of directors. If you win, you will lose a hell of a lot of money in the state every year you remain in business, because we're not going to allow you to pass through a nickel of your above market price gas. And within a week, they had a new board of directors. The company changed directions. This commission hasn't done any of it. You have to wonder, what was the First Energy Board doing? What was the guy? We don't know exactly what the executives were doing at the company. That, I suppose, is still under investigation. But we do know about the guilty plea, so they must have been doing something. Where's the commission? There are no guardrails at the commission. The regulators have to be the guardrails. And that's disappointing to me as a former regulator.
Now, you're talking about no checks and balances at the PUCO, but I'll let Kathiann and David weigh in on this. It seems like that wasn't the only place that there weren't checks and balances in this whole thing.
First Energy had very scanty controls, apparently, in its own company. There was this money pool that ratepayer money just went into, and then money came out of the money pool, and it was not tracked. And that just sets up the scheme for having, you know, money flow from the corporation that no one can track. So it went from the corporation to the 501c4 David referred to, where it was being laundered further, and nobody could trace it back. And the issue in a regulatory context arguably should be, can the utility prove it used the ratepayer money properly? And those cases are in limbo, in part due to the federal case, but in the meantime, there are charges accruing to Ohio ratepayers.
You had one point about that, because that's important. I wish Mr. DeVillers were still at the U.S. Attorney's Office, because the U.S. Attorney's Office needs to learn a little bit about Ohio law, because the problem is when they at the request of First Energy, the U.S. Attorney's Office asked the PUCO to stop whatever investigations they were doing. And frankly, those investigations, OCC was using, Consumers Council was using them very aggressively to try to get discovery, and the U.S. Attorney's Office asked them to stop. You can understand that they wanted their criminal investigations to proceed, although they're proceeding at a very leisurely pace, but they wanted those things to go ahead, and they didn't want to be interfered with. The problem is, under Ohio law and Supreme Court decision, the commission can't refund any money that's still being collected subject to the sort of poisonous tree of what remains of HB 6 in the law. Some was repealed, some wasn't. And what remains in it, and ratepayers are continuing to pay money, and under Ohio law, under the Supreme Court decision, that money goes, the utilities keep it. Even if it ultimately gets determined it was unlawful, the utilities will get to keep it, and only prospectively can be stopped. I think the court's decision was wrong, but the net effect of what the U.S. Attorney's Office did in stopping the commission from letting these investigations go ahead, the net effect was to make sure that the malefactors get to keep some of their ill-gotten gains and under the operation of Ohio law. So while I agree with the general principle that the Justice Department's investigation should be given, people shouldn't interfere with it, there may be sometimes you need to temper that by other considerations. And in this case, basically the victims, the consumers that were the victims of the crime, are going to continue to be victimized, in part because Ohio First Energy persuaded the U.S. Attorney to intervene to stop the investigation.
I will come to the defense of my successor, Ken Parker, who is now the current U.S. Attorney. So he did set a time, I believe, of 6 months, and that was about 4 months ago. I did the same. And when I was U.S. Attorney, I requested certain agencies, both county prosecutors and state AGs and others, to slow down on a lot of the discovery, especially depositions and things of that nature, because you'd be necessarily talking to witnesses that we want to talk to, or that the Department of Justice wants to talk to. So there is this idea that, yes, there are shareholders, stockholders, as well as the consumers at this time are to their detriment because it's taking as long as it's taking. But there are, again, remember, there was a deferred prosecution agreement where money was paid, to try to alleviate that to some extent. There's also the possibility of very wealthy individuals who can be fined and restitution, as well as seizures and forfeitures of ill-gotten gain that can be also thrown back into that pot to restitution to the consumers of the state of Ohio. Now, again, is that going to cure, what happened? No. But there was a time period put, I believe he did say 6 months, so that was about 4 months ago. So in 2 months, we can have this conversation again.
Well, it was 6 months unless I ask you again.
Yeah,
That's what he said. Yeah.
Were there warning signs, David? I mean, I think when you put out the case, I remember it was very well researched. You had gone through a lot of history of this. Were there warning signs, or were there things you picked up on as a prosecutor and thought, man, that should have been caught there?
Well, we read the papers too, right? And we watch the news and we look for signs, and we talk to whistleblowers and kind of would-be whistleblowers and people that think they have information. We gather that information, and just like us, we were hearing stories about. And I'm not saying anything that's not in public, that individuals, particularly for the petition to overthrow House Bill 6 to overturn it, that were getting bribed or paid or asked to leave or intimidated or threat. So yeah, we listen to that stuff, and that's the sort of thing when we do investigations, we keep that in the back of our mind.
Can I go back, because this goes beyond the prosecution. There are warning signs about First Energy that go back 30 and 40 years. Let me tell you about my first day at the PUCO. I mean, this was amazing. A lobbyist for one of what's now a subsidiary of First Energy, at that time there were 3 separate companies, in Ohio there were 3 separate companies, shows up in my office and he hands me, his first day on the job, he introduces himself, he gives me an envelope. I went, what is this, cash? I mean, why is he giving me an envelope? And I open it up, it's not cash, but it's a list of names with dollar figures, like, I'm making the names up, but Joe Smith, $8,000, Fred Schwartz, $7,000, so I said, what is this? It's just names and numbers. He said, well, I want you to know that the governor who appointed you has a lot of friends at our company, and this is how much money they've given to the governor's campaign. And I said, I want you to know, I don't want to know any of that. I don't really care. If they give money, that's their business. Why do I need to? Well, the governor appointed you. You need this. So right away, you say, well, what's going on here? And then over time, what you watch, it was interesting how different utilities lobbied the commission. And it was usually inversely proportionate to their performance in the marketplace. The companies that were the best run, they lobbied. Of course they lobbied, but when they lobbied, they were lobbying about policy, we want this. They weren't looking for crumbs to bail them out. Whereas First Energy was a consistent pattern and practice of aggressive, I won't get into things they may or may not have offered, but the clear things like the political contributions, making all sorts of suggestions about, consequences if you don't do this or if you don't do that. And then ultimately, the ultimate was when one of the CEOs of one of the First Energy companies, after we had denied them any increase in a rate case, came in and said to me, the CEO, his previous CEO, had just been fired because they lost in a rate case. And he came in and he said, we were shocked that you did what you did. What are you talking about? We read the record. You didn't make a case. In fact, you made a terrible case. And he said, well, we were told we come to Columbus and we buy a couple meals and everything's taken care of. And I said, wait a minute, you've insulted me at 2 levels. A, that I could be bought, and B, for a Big Mac?
So can I ask, Ashley, did you go to the FBI talking to them about this conversation?
It was difficult. No, I didn't. I probably should have. But, the problem that I had was the concern was, what do you do with this information? Because once it's out, everybody gets tarred, including commissioners and commission staff who, were totally innocent. And so the question is, how do you, you try to rectify it by what you do in your decisions. But, you can make a case that we should have reported it.
And that's why, and quite frankly, a lot of people don't understand what's a crime or not. I mean, that is a conspiracy to steal honest services fraud. I mean, and that's the kind of thing that's why we do want people to go to the FBI when they have information that I don't think this might necessarily be illegal because I wasn't actually bribed, I was more pressured. But that's the sort of thing that the FBI needs to go to and look at and move on with these things. You'd be surprised. I've never heard of a whistleblower or somebody that thinks they're blowing a whistle go to the FBI and be dissatisfied. Like, I've never heard a situation where they said the FBI, well, they just kind of didn't do anything, that they rested on their laurels. This is a terrorism, and public corruption is the FBI's #1 priority. And that's because and trust me, I've got a lot of problems with the FBI. We could do an entire talk about the problems with the FBI, but I'll give them credit when it comes to that sort of thing. They take it seriously, and it does move up and down the chain of command to the point I see some of my white-collar comrades shaking their heads, often to the chagrin of their clients, but it does happen, and they do work with
Just
it.
for the record, though, I never got the Big Mac.
And this is kind of indicative of what you found in reporting, that there were a lot of times where maybe someone had important information but didn't realize how important it was or didn't know where to go with it, right?
Right. And, you will have bits and pieces that come up, and it's kind of like, where does this fit? What's the story here? And you'll see, like in First Energy's case, we had this pattern over the course of a decade where there were efforts to try to get all the different things that were in House Bill 6. And they kept not succeeding until House Bill 6 rammed through, right? And then it's like, where do we find these things? What can we trace? What can't we trace? When the complaint came out while David was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio, they had $60 million. All I could trace was about $3 million. So a lot of this gets hidden, but it's, what can we piece together? What can we find? Who are the players? And there were some strange patterns we found, too, not just from First Energy, but political parties involved. A certain law firm showed up multiple places. So different things, and then you're like, okay, how does this work?
You have to remember, it's not just the one C4, this case First Energy, there are pass-throughs. So money going to First Energy came from a number of other C4s, not necessarily directly from Generation Now, the C4 Generation Now. Didn't come directly from First Energy. It went through some pass-through C4s with ridiculous names. And then it didn't necessarily go to buy commercials and things from Generation Now. It went to other pass-throughs. And when you're doing if you're doing an investigation as a prosecutor or the FBI or agencies, you've got to get all that stuff together. And when you don't even have the ability to look at their donors, and you don't, and I'll say this, for a time period, I think still today, you don't even, for a 501c4, even with the IRS, you don't have to declare your donors. You just have the money come in. You don't have to identify who they are. And so even if I were to get a judge or a U.S. attorney to sign off and let me get the tax records, because even as a prosecutor, even as the United States attorney, I still have to go through hoops to get federal income tax records. And even if I got it, it wouldn't say anything. It wouldn't tell me who the donors were. The only way I'll be able to find out is if I do a search warrant based on that particular C4, or maybe I do a subpoena, but they're dirty, right? They're not gonna really tell me the records. I can look at the money going into banks. We could try to do that. But even at those situations, then kind of the cat's out of the bag, because we're concerned even with banks, even when the subpoena says, please do not disclose this, depending on the banks, we don't know if they really will or won't.
Yeah, try being a reporter who doesn't even have access to all that information. I mean, it's difficult, right, Kathiann?
I mean, you have essentially, and this was pre-pandemic, you had a 2-year lag before you could get a hold of annual reports from these nonprofits. And again, you couldn't tell from the donors. You might luck out and find another C4 who lists a grant to a different organization. So that's how we were able to piece together the 3 million we could piece together. But it's a lot of pure chance and like, what's the name of this group? Oh, there it is, they showed up. We can connect this, we can connect that. But the other ones don't necessarily show up. And then with Generation Now, after they finally filed their 2017 report, so 2017 before most of this stuff, like, when the ideas allegedly generated, until, they filed that in December 2019, but then you don't get anything else filed by them, and they finally lost their certification. So the ability to track through public documents what was happening after was not there.
A friend of mine's a law professor was thinking about writing an article on the Supreme Court's view of campaign finance, which is basically that you have a constitutional right to bribe. And one of the cases they cite, and you folks probably know these cases, is the Blankenship case in West Virginia, which was, the court actually came down on the right side in that case. But what was interesting was it was a 5-4 decision where the Supreme Court of West Virginia, as in Ohio, was elected. And they had made a decision against, you remember Blankenship, the coal magnate, who ultimately went to jail for, I forgot exactly what he went to jail was, what I'm talking about now. But anyway, he was being sued by a competitor. And the Supreme Court of West Virginia affirmed a judgment against him by a 3-2 vote. There was an election a few months later, or actually a few weeks later. The candidate that Blankenship gave $3 million defeated one of the incumbent judge who had been part of the 3-member majority. They immediately held a rehearing and voted 3-2 the other way. Literally $3 million went from Blankenship. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in a 5-4 decision said it was inappropriate. Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice Roberts, actually wrote a dissent in which he said, just because he gave that money, it could just be coincidence. It doesn't explain that that's necessarily the reason. Well, it ain't necessarily so is not exactly compelling legal logic.
But this whole idea of dark money and not knowing where it's coming from, for years now, good government groups, I saw Katherine Turser in here with Common Cause, and if I've heard her say it once, I've heard her say it 50 times, that, they want politicians to make all of this money, whether it's in a dark money group or other money, they want it to be accountable. They want the public to be able to go in, trace it, know where this money's coming from. And, as you've pointed out, the Supreme Court has stood in the way of that, but it's actually gone the other way with this dark money because it's gained in popularity. And we see more dark money groups than we did maybe 10, 20 years ago. Is there a way, with the Supreme Court out of the picture, for accountability to become about in the dark money arena, and how can that happen?
Well, without the Constitution and that pesky Supreme Court, you could pass a state law requiring that all dark money groups, all C4s, disclose their donors, to the public. You could do that, and I think a lot of people would say, I'm not sure I like that either, but you could do it so it's not, an individual spending less than $500. The idea of a C4, right, it's a social betterment program. That's what it's supposed to be, and it's supposed to. The two things it's not supposed to be: its primary activity is not supposed to be political, and it's not supposed to be to the benefit of a particular individual or group, right, or an individual, right. It's not supposed to benefit somebody. That's pretty much what they do, right. So by being your primary political activity means that you can literally support or attack a candidate. Forget a cause or a law. A candidate, as long as you're spending less than 49% of your budget on donations on doing that. So you can do that. 100% can be passing or not passing a particular law, if that's your shtick. And the idea that it's not to benefit anybody, I think you could walk around the State House, not just in Ohio, but anywhere else, and every politician, office holders, it's widely known that, hey, this particular, that's, mayor such and such is C4. And they want you to know that, even though they're not on the list, they don't have direct control of it because someone else's name's on it, but they want you to know that, so you donate to that C4. And you get that kind of encouragement, you get that sort of benefit from whatever you're looking for from that particular politician or office holder. And so that's kind of, how it works.
And I guess what I would add to that is accounting for the fact that you do have this pesky Supreme Court would be, when you pass that law, to add into the preamble's legislative recognition of all the justifications for why you are having this, to tailor it to the Supreme Court opinion and to try to bulletproof it that way.
And I don't want to get completely nerded out on Supreme Court decisions, but the California case that she was referring to basically does recognize that there is a compelling state interest in fraud and self-serving within C4s. It says that. It says that's absolutely true. The issue is, all right, is the law narrowly tailored enough to effectuate that concern? In that particular case, the law basically, the Attorney General could gather all the Schedule Bs from all Cs, I think not even just C4s, but C3s as well. So have them all. And the Supreme Court, I think it was a 6-3 decision, said that's not narrowly tailored enough. All right, that's not. It's beyond strict scrutiny standard. And so it's got to be narrowly tailored. But what it did say was there's no reason they can't subpoena it, but also threw in there the idea of an audit letter. So there are ways around what they're saying. Basically what they're saying is you can't just say every single person give us this information, but you can send out random audit letters. You don't need like probable cause or reasonable suspicion and ask for this stuff and require it through an audit letter. So there's ways around that we can do. We can pass laws and have regulations to actually do it, but there's no political will to do it.
Let me propose an even narrower in the HB6 context, and also in the context of the recent article that appeared about the sports gambling. That if a company is licensed by the state or is dependent on a state concession, I think the compelling public policy argument for disclosing political contributions, whether they be through C4s or just open ones, and policing that, at a minimum, requiring disclosure, perhaps even prohibitions in some cases, ought to be clear. If, for example, I'm assuming that the article's right, that substantial contributions are made to the Republican Governors Association, that money ends up in Governor of Ohio's campaign fund, and the concessions are granted to the contributor, who wouldn't suspect something happened? So it seems to me the state has a very legitimate interest in trying to protect against that. So as opposed to, I'm not saying opposed to, but in addition to the possibility of having broad prohibitions on or requirements of disclosure, you could pass something more narrowly tailored to focus on who has a state license, who is dependent on state concessions, who's asking the state for things. If somebody's laundering money through dark funds, and then ends up with big state concessions, there's a prima facie case suspicion is warranted.
Well, we'll move to questions from our live stream and in-person audiences in just a few minutes. So if you have a question, make your way to the microphone back there in the back of the room right now. And if you're watching online, please type your questions into the chat box. Before we take audience questions, I have one final question for our panel here. Since Citizens United, the use of dark money in politics has increased significantly. At the same time, social media has taken off, giving voice to often anonymous people and bots who often put out false, misleading statements about candidates and issues. Do you see this as kind of a double whammy on the politics and democracy in general? And do you think that there is a way in there to try to get some checks and balances?
I mean, one of the things that I've done in other work is write about fact-checking and scrutiny, and if it's anonymous, don't believe it. But that's a big hurdle to take, and it's a big challenge. And yes, ultimately, it is harmful to democracy, because you look at studies from Pew, and they've said, oh yeah, we tune out when we see all this, or I don't watch the news as much. And then we have the shrinking media markets, right? Fewer news outlets. So it really is a problem for democracy ultimately. And that's at heart why this corruption case matters, because it's about whether elected representatives are representing the public.
Well, it's the CMC's longstanding tradition to take audience questions, and Doug Buchanan is back there curating questions from today's live stream audience. And those of us in person, I see some of you back at the microphone, willing and wanting to ask questions. So out of respect for others, we ask that you keep your questions brief and to the point so we can get to as many as possible. And please keep in mind that questions are questions. They end with a question mark, not a statement. So Doug, what's the first question?
Jo, thank you very much, and thank you to today's panelists. We have a lot of questions submitted from the live stream audience and from our other registrants in advance, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'll start with this one. Greg Coleridge asks, in addition to any former public officials, others who received dark money bribes and First Energy leadership being held accountable for this historic scandal, how should the First Energy corporate entity, separate from its human leadership, be held accountable since it has admitted to its involvement in the bribery scheme? Should it be dissolved, as is suggested in Attorney General Dave Yost's suit?
So they have been held accountable through the deferred prosecution agreement to some extent. So I know everyone hears a DPA and they're like, they're getting away with it because you can't send an entity to prison, all right? So I can talk about this forever, but you look at you want to punish the enterprise or the entity to such an extent, you're gonna punch in the stomach hard enough where it doesn't want to do it again, right? But you don't want to kill it because you don't want all these people to get fired. You want all their vendors to lose their jobs. You don't want to completely kill First Energy in and of itself because it will hurt in the end, it will hurt the consumer. It will. But can you hurt it enough where you're getting some sort of restitution to the consumer, where you where you're looking over it? By the way, so a deferred prosecution agreement, if they were prosecuted, no one would go to prison and they'd be on probation to a judge. Right? In this case, it'd be Judge Black. Judge Black has got like 6 people, probation officers, that look at things. A deferred prosecution agreement means the Department of Justice is overseeing it, or they're forcing First Energy to hire a law firm to oversee it. And so now you got DOJ with like 100 people looking over your shoulder every day, or a law firm that has got an incentive to find that you screwed up looking over your shoulder every day. I would prefer being on probation than have a DPA with DOJ looking over my shoulder, because they can and they will, if they screw up, they'll yank them another 10 years, get another couple $100 million in fines, and that happens. It happens a lot. So DPAs aren't as nice as you think. A lot of people don't want DPAs because of the DOJ oversight. And I was not part of Vipal Patel, who was my immediate successor, worked on the DPA, but trust me, there were a lot of people within the Department of Justice and the energy consultants saying, all right, how do we hurt this company so bad that it survives? And they came up with I'm not sure how many $100 million to do it. And that's what they came up with.
You know, it's interesting, setting aside the DPA and whether the fine that they had to pay, which is, given the size of the company, it's sort of like you or I getting a parking ticket. But setting that aside for a second, here's another place where Ohio regulation has just simply failed, because the Ohio Commission has a number of powers it could invoke. You know, I mentioned the past firing a board. First of all, what was the First Energy Board of Directors doing while this was going on? These guys are making a lot of money doing literally no oversight. Or if they weren't doing oversight, then they were complicit in the crime. One way, either way, they shouldn't have been there. So, but that's one possibility. Another is the scenario that Mr. DeVilliers is pointing out, which is, you know, that the people could lose their job. That's not going to happen with the utility. What will happen is the commission could and the commission has in the past for small utilities, hasn't done it for a company this size, but if you think about it, could put it into receivership. Most of the employees, the company can't just go away because of all of its obligations to the public. But those are going to be taken care of. What you want to do is remove the top management. No employees are going to lose their job. Equipment isn't going to disappear. Somebody's going to take over that company ultimately, and there's a procedure under Ohio law that could be done. How could a Public Utilities Commission see a company pleading guilty to crime of this dimension and then literally do very little about it? Then I can't say they did nothing. They have these 4 marginal investigations that are stopped for the moment. But there are tools that the commission has. The legislature years ago gave the commission tools. This is exactly the case where they ought to be used, and they're just not using it. They're not doing anything of that level of consequence. Consumers may end up getting, stop having to pay certain money. But what's clear is that all the remedies that government in general, not just DOJ, have to remedy the situation are not being put to work.
I 100% agree. Receivership, monitorship, I mean, those are the things they need to look at. And that can still, to some extent, happen. And you're right, we, not me anymore, but DOJ is saying, hey, hold off for a little bit, let us work on this, and we'll see how the chips fall.
Next question.
Even after all the problems that have been documented with House Bill 6, the criminal problems, Governor DeWine continues to defend it as good public policy, and he said that the law preserved the jobs at the nuclear power plants and the carbon-free power that they produced. And I'd like to know what the panel thinks about the governor's point of view.
What's fascinating about and I put this in quotes, the policy underlying HB 6 is there isn't any. It's not coherent policy. Unless you want to basically bail out First Energy, that's the only policy that's implicit. Let me tell you why I say that. First, if you think about sort of the grand scheme of how different groups view energy policy and energy regulation in the United States, there's I'm going to simplify this vastly, but there's 2 schools of thought. One is strong economic and environmental regulation, and another is free market, which may also have environmental regulation, but the economic regulation is relaxed. HB 6 manages to be offensive to both schools of thought. For one, subsidizing nuclear units which are unable to compete in the market, and there's a whole history of this. In fact, ratepayers are being asked, we're being asked at HB 6 to pay basically for a 3rd or 4th time, depending on how you count, for the same power plant. So subsidizing a plant that's not competitive to make it compete against plants that are screws up the free market. So if you're pro-competition, you're pro-free market, HB 6 is offensive. It screws up the free market. The flip side, from an environmental standpoint, and the governor, I think, actually said, well, this is green because there's no carbon being emitted by nuclear. That is a factual matter, is correct. There is no carbon emitted. On the other hand, if that's the objective of the bill, why do you subsidize 2 old coal plants that are dirty? Why do you get rid of utility programs for energy efficiency? Why do you do, and I don't want to get into the weeds, but why do you you remove the efficiency requirement and still uncouple rates, so all risks, most of the risks that a utility assumes are being imposed on customers? All of those things fly in the face of any kind of consideration of environment. So one of the things people would ask me at the forums we would conduct at the Kennedy School, how do you explain what your home state's doing on this? How do you explain that? And I, frankly, without even knowing what the U.S. attorney knew, I said, you can't explain it except First Energy's lobbying. And lobbying's a generous term, given what happened. But that's the only way you could explain it, because there is no coherent policy that underlies anything.
Anyone have anything to add on that one, or go to the next question?
I think you nailed it.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll go to our next question. Doug?
Joe, thank you. Ward Cornett asks, can you please discuss, and probably briefly because I imagine this is could be a detailed answer, could you please discuss the Citizens United ruling and how that plays into the dark money topic?
Doesn't. I mean, Citizens United created super PACs. That is, businesses and unions can donate on as much money as they want to a super PAC, but super PACs are regulated by the FEC, and their donor lists are there. So we all know, when Bloomberg's donating to a particular super PAC or anybody else or any company. What C4s are a bit different in that they were created by the tax code. all right? And they're up until the Supreme Court's made a couple rulings last year in 2021, kind of, and has restricted it to some extent. Citizens United didn't say anything about anonymous donations being a constitutional right. In fact, within Citizens United, it kind of hints that it's not. So it really has nothing to do with it other than it did start rolling the ball with unlimited amounts of money going into political issues and campaigns.
And just to add on to that, it does not need to necessarily be a 501c4. We saw hardworking Ohioans, which was one of the pass-through groups, was, LLC, for-profit. But you can't get the records because they're private. So it can be done in different ways, but the complication is when you add the dark money groups in, you get rid of the reporting for the super PACs that otherwise exists under federal law.
Next question?
Dark money is such an obvious invitation to corruption of regulatory agencies, elections, what have you. So much so that even a Russian dictator, if he prefers a certain presidential candidate, can help elect that person without us knowing it. When there are situations like that, politicians usually have a yes, but. They have there are reasons for it. There's another side to the story. Is there another side to the story of dark money? Is there something good about it?
Yeah, real quick. So the idea is, it's a balance, right? The good is very, very much, and the bad's a lot. But let's say I'm a guns rights guy, right? And I work for a company where my leadership is anti-Second Amendment or very much into gun restrictions. And I have this earnest feeling that I'm a Second Amendment guy. I want to support it. But I don't want my boss to know because I don't want to not get promoted or maybe get fired or punished in some way. So I can donate money to, NRA's got a C4, right? So I could donate money to C4 anonymously and not have to worry about the repercussions. It's kind of like the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, that were from our, we have a huge history of anonymous speech. Now we're saying anonymous speech with financing, and that's a difference, and the Supreme Court hasn't necessarily recognized that and has not recognized that as a constitutional right, but that is the kind of the theme behind it. The idea of not being punished for supporting a group and doing it anonymously through money.
And next question?
Thank you, Joe. Sandra Fire asks, how do we get Ohio voters to pay more attention to this kind of corruption? HB 6 seemed to fade from view as we approach the election, and it seems Ohioans have forgotten or don't care.
Actually, it would always be helpful if the Democratic candidate for governor even talked about the issue. Ohio's a strange place. And I try to explain to people there is no Ohio. There's a bunch of cities that go in a million different directions, a lot of small towns. But there's nothing and so the result is, I think, unique among major states. I think the press corps that covers Columbus is way under-resourced. And so a lot of things don't get the kind of coverage they do. And part of the reason is because, you got Toledo at one end, Cincinnati. I grew up in Cincinnati. I honestly thought for a while I lived in Kentucky because there was more Kentucky news in Cincinnati than there was anything about Ohio. I can't resist the story. The classic Ohio story and why Ohio doesn't get covered. 1961, March, governor of Ohio was Michael DeSalle. Michael DeSalle is the only Toledoan ever to be governor of Ohio. And in March of 61, somebody pokes his head and one of his aides says, "Governor, did you hear?" He goes, "Hear what?" "Ohio State's in the NCAA finals tonight." "They are? Let's put out a proclamation. They're the greatest team in the nation." They put out the proclamation, and 5 minutes later said, "Governor, didn't anybody tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Their opponent's Cincinnati." He didn't know. He's from Toledo. He was a Michigan fan, right? I mean, that's what they root for in Toledo. But the result is even though you've got a lot of media presence in Ohio, they devote precious few resources. And of course, as newspapers go into decline, even less than they used to what goes on at the State House. And I would argue, I've lived in several states. This is the state where state government is the least covered. It's not because there aren't good reporters, it's because they're under-resourced. For example, when I was on the commission, the Dayton Daily News had a guy who I regard as the finest utility reporter in the state. I mean, really knowledgeable. And they took him off covering the commission and put him covering the crime beat in Miami County because there was more interest in that. So part of the problem lies with the fact that there is no real center of state government is not anybody's central focus in the press, so it doesn't get attention. Then you depend on what political candidates say. And if they don't talk about something, and obviously, Governor DeWine wasn't going to talk about it in the election, you'd think the Democrat would have, but she barely did. And so as a result, it gets no attention, and that's part of the problem. There's nobody to really focus on it.
Kathiann and I did not put him up to saying that, by the way.
Kathy needs a higher salary, it's clear.
You might have put him up to that, I don't know.
I was just going to add that the whole referendum stage of the House Bill 6 saga kind of illustrates another point that's related to it, which is that there's a burnout or people tune out. So when there were all these Chinese conspiracy mailers going out, even though, Energy News Network had this great feature article on, who was behind the Chinese conspiracy ads, right? When I would talk to people, they'd be like, I don't bother with it. They're all the same. I don't have to pay attention, right? And that tuning out of the public, I think, is what people are relying upon and why that makes that so dangerous.
Well, we have one quick question that we can take here before the end, so I'm going to let you ask that.
You mentioned the former PUCO director earlier, and as a former unclassified civil servant, my question for Mr. DeVillers is, how can bribery be a crime at the front end with somebody admitting they paid a bribe, and it not be a crime at the back end where the recipient is indicating that the payment was just for good government or whatever? In the case of the former PUCO director specifically, and would you expect any additional people to be charged as this continues to unfold? Thank you.
I have to be very careful what I say here. So I will say that even when we first announced the arrest and the complaint, the one thing we put forward was this is the beginning of the investigation to a large extent. And it really was, because it went from a covert, we were hiding everything, to overt, where we could actually go talk to people and do search warrants and things. And then I indicated clearly we have the bribees that we've charged, that we've alleged. We don't have any bribers. Like, no one from First Energy's been charged yet, right? Except now that they've charged to the deferred prosecution agreement. That's just the entity. None of the individuals have been charged, at least of yet. So the quick answer to your question is you're absolutely 100% right. The caveat is, wait, it's still going on. There's still an investigation. I have the utmost trust in Ken Parker. I have the utmost trust in the FBI that have been investigating this, and the AUSA is on this case. I truly have been off the case since I've I've resigned, since the president fired me. But at the same time, I'm telling you, these are extremely intelligent, extremely trustworthy individuals, and they'll get to the bottom of this.
But they're slow.
Yeah.
They're the government. Yeah.
Well, we wish we had more time, but we don't. So I'm going to turn this back over to Doug Buchanan with Columbus Business First for some concluding remarks.
All right, well, I hope you found today's forum very useful ahead of the trial that starts next week. I thought that was great. I know one of my takeaways is to be very wary of men in suits offering Big Macs. So I'll keep that in mind. Demand a steak, yes, of course. Thank you to today's forum sponsor, Barnes and Thornburg, and to the Grange Insurance Autobahn Center for their support and for hosting us. Thank you to our virtual seat patrons, the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream. Our very special appreciation to today's speakers, Ashley Brown, David DeVillers, Kathiann Kowalski, and our host, Jo Ingles. Let's have another round of applause for all of them. And Please make plans now to attend next Wednesday's forum, again here at the Grange Insurance Audubon Center. The forum will be The Kids Aren't All Right, Closing COVID's Learning Gap, hosted by Action for Children's Eric Karolak. Thank you. And lastly, our thanks to each and every one of you. We couldn't do it without you. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.